linear pricing or smart pricing by associated labor. Again, as we've gone through, we've been doing a series of webinars in regards to what we call the smart pricing suite inside of ROIder. This is the 5th of 6. And again, the topic today is going to be linear pricing by associated labor. As we go through, we're going to spend most of our time over in the configuration side. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to jump over on the left-hand side into my configuration icon. And just to kind of level set what we covered in some of our earlier webinars, where we're going to spend our time is underneath configuration and then down to parts. And then we're going to get into what's called set pricing method. I'm not going to go through this window in as much depth as I have in an earlier webinar. I have spent an entire webinar going through just talking about the functionality here. However, I'm going to at least take a second to go back through a little bit of what I feel is the priority and or the important elements as you look at this window here. The first piece I always point out is that you'll notice there are small gray boxes around this top section and then a larger one here around the bottom. You'll notice parts and inventory and outside purchases. We can set different pricing rules for parts that are coming off of our shelf versus parts that we're buying on the outside. So again, parts and inventory versus outside purchases, the first delineation. The second is you'll notice there's a series of radio buttons that you can click on down here. There are really 3 different pricing methods in ROIder. There's what's called a cost plus multiplier. And a cost plus multiplier is just a straight line. And what I mean by that is we give it a number, let's say 3 times. And it doesn't matter whether the part is 50 cents, $5, $50, or 500. It's going to use that same cost plus multiplier to figure out what the sell price to the consumer would be. So again, cost plus multiplier is just a straight line. The second pricing method would be what's called a matrix. The matrix is a fairly common concept in retail where we might establish ranges. From 0 to 5, we'll mark it up 5 times. From 5 to 20 is 4. From 20 to 50 is 3. From 50 to 100 is 2.5. And wherever the numbers fall, the concept of the matrix is you're going to build ranges, and then we'll use that range. So again, a little smarter than a cost plus multiplier, because now that 50-cent part gets marked up at a higher margin or a higher percentage than maybe that $50 part or that $500 part. It's a gradual decrease. However, there's a problem with the matrix, and that is as you cross over from one range to the next. Again, if you think about my example, if I was going to mark up a part from 0 to $5 5 times and 501 to 20 4 times, well, the part that cost me $5 I sell for 25. A part that cost me $5.01 I sell for $20.04. So there's an immediate drop off as you cross over from one range to another. So you'll notice the third way that we can price things is what we call smart matrix pricing. Now, this is the one difference between Gen 1 and Gen 2, and it's a difference in name only. If you're on, let's say, 1.31 or a version of Gen 1, and you come into this window here, these last 2 options underneath parts and inventory, and these 3 options here that all say smart matrix will say linear pricing. The functionality does not change a bit. It's just we've changed the name or the term. We refer to it now as smart matrix pricing versus what we used to call linear pricing. It's a change in name only, not in functionality. So there's your difference between Gen 1 and Gen 2 as it relates to today's topic, and that is smart matrix pricing versus linear, just the way the boxes are named, no difference in the functionality. Now we're going to focus on outside purchases today. You'll notice in my outside purchases, there are 7 different options versus 5 for parts and inventory. For parts and inventory, we typically would recommend you assign a supplier to that part. You assign a department to that part. And so it's natively embedded into the inventory record, and therefore very easy to differentiate pricing based on either the supplier and or the department. Neither of those options works quite as well for outside purchases. As I'm adding a part to a ticket, I don't always immediately assign a department to that part, or I don't immediately assign a supplier to that part. So in those cases, we're going to only apply the default pricing until such time as we would assign either the supplier and or the department. So with outside purchases, we give you an additional methodology by which you can do your pricing, and that's what's called smart pricing by associated labor. I'm going to select smart matrix pricing by associated labor. You'll notice I get an extra option that shows up down here at the bottom, so I'll explain that in just a moment. But smart matrix pricing by associated labor is kind of the most intricate or the most granular way that you can use smart pricing for outside purchases. What we mean by associated labor is the job that we select is going to define the markup. Meaning, if I pick the job that says install air filter, and then I assign a part to it, it says, well, if there is a specific pricing matrix associated with that air filter job, then apply it to the parts that are assigned. If I had a smart job to, let's say, install brake rotors, system says, well, if I've got a specific pricing rule assigned to that brake rotor job. So again, literally every different job that you perform that's pre-canned in your system, meaning either a labor operation or if you're using the Epic or SmartyCAD integration, a smart job, the system allows you to differentiate the pricing. Now, it's not that difficult to set up, meaning I don't have to go through all 500 smart jobs and build a separate smart matrix for them. We'll see in just a moment how we can assign them by category, or we can just leave the default as the primary and then associate only the jobs that we want at a different level as we go through. So we're going to pick smart matrix pricing by associated labor. I said in this bottom box, you get an extra option. This bottom box is intended to help define as we move through the course of a transaction how smart pricing behaves. For example, when correcting required entries during finalize, should I enable smart pricing, disable smart pricing, or prompt the user to accept the pricing changes? This would be if, let's say, we had smart matrix pricing by department turned on and or by supplier, and then during the finalize process, we changed either the supplier or the department and or assigned if they weren't yet assigned. And the system says, well, now based upon the new information you provided, I want to change the price. And in my case, I've got it set to disable. When I hit finalize, I've likely already got an agreed upon price point with the customer. I don't want the system to change it, whether up or down, at that point or at the point of finalizing. Earlier on would have been the appropriate time to do that in the transaction's life cycle. As you look at the option that came up as we checked or clicked on the option for smart matrix pricing by associated labor, what you'll see is that when cutting and pasting parts from one job to another, certainly I might add 5 different labor jobs, 10 different parts onto a ticket, and I may realize that, you know what, I assigned the part to the wrong job, so I want to move it from one to another. What it's asking me here is if I move a part from one job to another, and there is going to be a difference in the calculated price based upon the new job it's assigned to, what should I do? And your options are either to allow it to just change the price, don't change the price, or the option I've got selected in my preference here would be I want you to prompt me before you change the price. So again, it's going to give us a message box that says, hey, this used to be X and now it's Y. Do you want us to continue forward? Down towards the bottom, there's an option that says when parts inventory are not in stock, and again, this applies to all of the different options. Should we use outside purchase or parts in inventory or use the greater of the two? And in my case, I'm telling it I want to use my outside purchase rules and then use the inventory price if it's greater than what it would be based upon my outside purchase rules. So again, just a little bit about what's called the set pricing method functionality before we go ahead and get out of here. And where we're going to configure this, again, what we call linear pricing or smart pricing by associated labor is only applicable to outside purchases. So underneath my parts menu, I'm going to default outside purchase pricing. When we get in here, notice I've got a series of 4 tabs across the top. Starting out on the settings tab, where this is where we're going to define the markups of how we're going to actually mark these up. The labor operations, it would apply to the categories and or a supplier adjustment. And we'll touch on each of those tabs as we go through this morning's conversation. But let's start on the settings tab. Whenever I talk about this window or this tab, I always try to explain to people that this looks a lot more complex than it actually is. The first piece is there's this graph up at the top, and the only thing this is intended to do is to give you a visual cue. And what I mean by that is, in a typical matrix, it's going to gradually decrease the markup as the price of the part goes up. So as I'm looking at this line, this should be just a gradual curve that moves from left to right. If it looks like the Rocky Mountains with spikes going through, then we probably have something configured incorrectly. The typical way this would be set would make it a gradual curve as it moves from left to right. So again, the graph is just there as a visual cue to help us get a comfort level that we've configured this correctly. Where it says settings, all we have to do here is we have to just tell it, well, from 0 to $1, we're going to mark it up, and again, we define a number. At $5, what should it mark up the part? At $20, what should it mark up the part? And we give you an opportunity to adjust these, and we'll do that in a little bit later example. We'll make it a little bit different, but what we're working with right now is what we call our default outside purchase. So when we first go to set up smart pricing, we'll set up the default. And this essentially says, if I don't establish any specific rules, then you're going to adhere to the default. So it's really kind of, we're going to work to the exceptions. I'm going to create my default, and that may apply to 90% of what I do each day. But then I'm going to build additional matrices to help handle that extra 10%. Maybe I only want to have 3 different matrices, one for my general repair, one for tires, and one for batteries. Okay, great. We're going to build the default to handle all of those general repairs, and then we'll build separate matrices for both the tires and the batteries as we go through. So we'll get my settings. Again, what we're going to do here is we're going to say, well, for parts from 0 to $1, on the low end and the high end, it is still a range. So again, the concept of the old matrix. It says from 0 to this price point, mark it up this number. Now, if you notice, cost plus multiplier, margin, and markup. Again, another section where this looks a lot more complicated than it is. They are 3 different calculations, but they essentially do the same thing. What I mean by that is, if I mark something up 4.5 times, that means that I will achieve a 77.78% margin, and or that would be a 350% markup. If I said, well, I want to mark up parts from 0 to $1 5 times, if you watch when I change that cost plus multiplier, it changes the margin and the markup along with it. If I said, you know what, at a $5 part, I want to be at a 74% margin. When I put that into my margin value, it says, well, that would require a 3.85 times cost plus multiplier and or a 285% markup. So they're all there because there are different concepts or schools of thought in terms of how people are pricing. Pick the one that most applies, change the value, and it will change the others in companion. So again, when we go to set this up with a brand new user, the conversation is just this. So if you bought a part for $5, what would you sell it for? If the answer is, well, I'd sell it for $20, then great. The cost plus multiplier becomes 4 times. Or if the answer is, well, I'd want to make a 76% margin on that, then great. We'll just fill that value in. And again, it's going to adjust the other calculations accordingly as we go through. What would you sell a part that costs $20 for? And again, make the appropriate adjustments as we go along. So again, all we have to do here is just, when a part costs me this, what are you going to sell it for? And then all we have to do is figure out, well, again, that becomes this much as the margin and or this much as a cost plus multiplier. Notice down here at the bottom, there's also an option for a minimum price. In a case where we're using the ranges and we're marking them up variably as we go along, the minimum price really applies most on the low end. What I mean by that is, well, right now, the way my margin or my smart pricing is set is for parts that cost me between $0 and $1, we're going to mark them up 5 times. So I bought a part that costs $1, we'd mark it up 5 times, we'd sell it for $5. I bought a part that costs 50 cents, we'd mark it up 5 times, we'd sell it for $2.50. I bought a part for $0.25, we'd mark it up 5 times and sell it for $1.25. What the minimum price can do is it can allow you to say, well, you know what, I don't ever want to be below this number. So again, in my case, I've got my minimum price set to $2.99, so that $5 or that part that cost me $1 would still sell for $5. The 50-cent part would sell for $2.99, as would the 25-cent part, because it's going to do the math and figure out that it's fallen below my minimum number, and then go ahead and mark it up accordingly to whatever that minimum price would be. In other examples where we've looked at, let's say, either pricing by department or supplier, we've looked at instances where you could use the minimum price to do, let's say, tiered pricing. If I said, let's see, everything from $1 to $5 will sell for $19.99, well, I can make that my minimum price. From $5 to $20 will sell for $49.99. And again, so you could use the minimum price, but most of the time it's more applicable when you have a specific category of parts where you want to do what I term tiered pricing, to use that minimum price in areas other than just that opening or that entry point, that very first range that sits in the upper left-hand corner. Down to the lower left-hand corner where it says Global Parts Rounding Options applies to all matrices. What we can do is we can either not round or we can round up. We do not allow you to follow traditional rounding rules. So what I mean by that is, when we typically round, if it's a 5, it goes up to 9. If it's a 4 or less, it goes down to 0. So if we did our math and it came up and it said, well, it's going to be $12.49, by traditional rounding rules, if we're rounding the nearest dollar, that would be $12. In our case, we only round up, so $12.49 becomes $12.99, as does $12.01. We're going to round up, and again, you can define the rounding parameter to either go to the 10th place, so 99s or 50s, or the 100th place. So just change that last value to 0, 5, or 9. If you think about it, rounding up on each part makes a difference of 49.5 cents if we're rounding to 50 or 99, and 4.5 cents if we're rounding to just 0s, 5s, or 9s. So again, while it doesn't mean real money or huge money on each individual part record, certainly if I'm selling, let's say, 40 parts a day, that 50-cent rounding, again, just to make the math easy, works out to be about 20 bucks a day, 120 bucks a week, 500 bucks a month, $6,000 a year, roughly, if I'm rounding 40 parts a day. So it becomes real money very quickly as we're going through. But so again, apply your rounding. You'll notice it says applies to all matrices. We don't let you apply different rounding rules to different matrices inside of the outside purchase and or inventory. We're going to assign that rounding rule, and it's going to apply to each as we go through. So you define that once, and it carries forward from there. Over to the right-hand side, we've got our sample cost, where I said, well, let's see, based upon where I've got my pricing currently set, what if I bought a part for $7.50? What would that sell for? And when I click on calculate, it says, well, let's see, based upon the way you're currently set, it's 16.67% in progression, meaning it's 16.67% away from here to here. So therefore, the margin we're going to assign is 74.62%. That's 16% of the way from here to here, or a 3.94 times cost plus multiplier, 16% of the way from here to here. So therefore, we'd sell that for $29.55, but because we're rounding, $29.99 would be the selling price for that part that cost me $7.50. So this is really just kind of a what if. I've changed my matrix. I'm trying to understand the impact. How about a part that cost me $55? Well, let's see. If we calculate that, it says, well, now we're 10% of the way from here to here. So 10% of the way from here to here is going to be 2.36. So therefore, it's going to work out to be $129.80 rounded to $129.99. Down at the bottom, our minimum profit margin for default parts. And then also, if you hit the price calc button, what's going to come up by default as the cost plus multiplier back on the ROI side. These settings, this first page, this settings tab, is the same regardless of the method we're using, meaning we're talking today about by associated labor, but whether you're doing it by supplier and or department, this first tab does not change. So again, very easy once you understand this tab to change from one methodology to the other. What does change are the tabs across the top, where you'll notice we've got labor operations, we've got labor categories, and then we also have what's called a supplier adjustment. Notice I've got all of my categories included in this price matrix, but some of my labor operations are not. In this case, I've specifically taken a handful out. We're going to add them all back in, just so that we can go ahead and talk about, well, what about, or how do I configure this? Right now, all of my categories, all of my operations are assigned to my default. And I've decided I'd like to create a different matrix for my break work. So again, I'm not so worried about $0 to $1. I'm probably not worried about 250 and above. So if I come up here to the top where it says matrix name, I'm going to go ahead and create a new one. In this case, my matrix name is just going to be called breaks, and we'll just make it smart matrix, just so that I know that this is why I created it. So if I go ahead and create that matrix, when I do, it says, well, everything's going to be 0. I was on the categories tab, and so I can now say, well, let's go ahead and let's add breaks. So I don't have to go through all of the operations. When I add the category, then now everything underneath that break category is going to adhere to this matrix. So I come back to my settings tab, and I say, well, I really don't sell too much on the break world, less than 20 bucks. not necessarily the case. Certainly hardware kits or seals maybe, but let's use this just as an example. And then from 20 to 40, and then from 40 to 60, and then from 60 to 80, from 80 to 100, from 100 to 150, and then we'll just say $200 and above. And so anything from 0 to 20, I'm going to want to mark that up 4 times. And then from 20 to 40, at $40, we're going to mark that up 3.5. At 60, we'll mark it up 3 times. At 80, we're going to be down to 2.5. At 100, we'll be down to 2.25, 2 times. At 150, and then 1.75 at $200 and above. And again, take my numbers with a grain of salt. I'm not necessarily saying these are realistic. I'm just showing that, hey, this is how we would go through and configure. And so now we've assigned that to all of my brake labor jobs. So when I go ahead and hit Save Changes, then now from this point forward, when I assign a part to a brake job that is an outside purchase, it's going to vary the labor or vary the matrix. So what I mean by that is I come in here and we're going to go ahead and we're going to assign a part. And I've got Pat Clark in a 2002 Ford Mustang. I'm just going to add a labor job onto the ticket. And in that labor job, we're going to go ahead and start out by adding one for air conditioning, and we'll go ahead and just add AC compressor remove and replace. I'll hit next to add that on, and I want to add a job within my brakes, and we'll go ahead and we'll say, let's go ahead and let's add on the job to replace the front disc brake pads. So now I have 2 different labor operations that are on this ticket. Again, the labor charge that's associated, somewhat irrelevant, at least to this conversation. But if I said, let's add a job or add a part to the AC compressor job. So I come in here and I click on parts, and again, I'm just adding a random part into the system, and my cost on that is going to be $50. It says, well, let's see, $50, we're going to mark it up, it's going to be $120.99. And if I wanted to know, well, why did it decide to do that? When I look at it, it says, well, we're using, in this case, outside purchase pricing rules, and I have to change or I have to close our writer, and I apologize. In order to have it take effect, I changed my pricing methodology. So let me close and reopen the Hour Writer program. Anytime we make that change in configuration to change from one pricing methodology to another, we'll have to close and reopen the program. So bear with me for just a moment while I go through the exercise. You go ahead and let Hour Writer come back up, and then again, we're going to jump back into Pat Clark as soon as it does. And then we should still have those 2 different labor operations on there, the one for the AC compressor, the other one for installing the brake pads. And what we should be able to see is that, again, as we're now assigning a part to those, we will see that there are now different matrices assigned to each. So here's Pat Clark with her 2002 Ford Mustang. And then as I come in here, we're going to add that part onto a transaction again. So AC compressor remove and replace. When I come in here, I'm going to take this part off of there just because it got added underneath the old matrix. So into the part window I go, and again, ABC 1, 2, 3. And then my cost per unit is going to be $50. So again, it comes up and it says, well, the reason that I decided that was the case is we're using labor linear pricing, and the operation has a matrix. It's using the default outside purchase, so 2.4 times with my rounding, $120.99. Now, if I went to the install front disc brake pads job, so if I go ahead and pick that one up and click on parts, and again, we'll add on just a random part, and then again, give it that $50 price point, what you'll notice is, well, now it says, well, because I'm assigned to a brake job, which has its own matrix, I'm assigning a completely different price. And when I look at my question mark there, it says, well, the smart matrix price rules to use is brakes smart matrix, which in this case, 3.25 or $162.99. So again, you can see that as I assign it from one to the other, it's changing the markup just based upon the job that we're using. That setting that we looked at inside of the set pricing methods, where it says if I cut and paste from one to the other, again, what I can tell the system to do is to either change it, not change it, and or prompt. So if the price would change based upon the job that we've assigned it to, now it should go ahead and allow us to change the price when applicable based upon my configurable settings. We come back into our configuration window. So there's labor categories, and then there is labor operations. Again, you'll notice there are no operations included in this matrix. But again, the way that this behaves is it follows the lowest common denominator. What I mean by that is If we've configured a rule for the category, that rule carries the day unless we have configured a rule specifically for the labor operation. What I mean by that is, let's go ahead and let's create a rule. You know what? I've got one for my brakes, but I'd like to create one specifically for my rotors. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create one specifically for my brake rotors. And oh, by the way, the jobs that are going to go into this are going to be in my brake category. And there we've got my rears. So we'll grab my left, my right, and both. And then if I go up a little further, I got to find my fronts. So we're going to move those over. So then now what it's saying is, okay, my brake category has a rule. However, these 6 jobs specifically have a completely different rule. And just so that we can see that, I'm just going to say, well, let's go ahead and let's make this, I'm going to make them all 2 times. So in this case, I'm not configuring everything in this list. I'm just basically saying anything that costs me from $0 to $10,000. The odds that I'm selling a brake rotor that costs me more than 10 grand, not great. We're just going to mark those up 2 times. And when I hit save changes, now if I came back in here, I said, let's go ahead and let's add another labor job onto this transaction. Now it's going to be brakes. And then this time, if I scroll down a little bit, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do both front rotors, remove and replace. And I add that job onto my transaction. Now I go to add a part onto that labor operation. And again, it doesn't really matter what the part number is. What matters here is when I get to my cost, where as I go ahead and I add that cost in there, again, what it's doing is it's essentially doing a 2 times cost plus multiplier. It's applying my smart pricing rules, and the matrix pricing rule uses brake rotors, which is a 2 times cost plus multiplier. So again, when I say the lowest common denominator, what I really mean is if you've configured it and you've assigned the category, then the entire category will follow that rule unless you specifically go in and configure something for an individual labor operation. Then that would then carry the day. One last configurable option as far as linear or smart matrix pricing is concerned, and that's a supplier adjustment. What this would allow you to do is to say, well, let's see, as long as it's this supplier, then you could just mark it up 0%. But if you'll notice, if I said, let's go to my dealer parts, I want to drop the price with a dealer part by 30%. And or I might say, well, you know what, when it's from CarQuest, I want it to be 50% more. So what you can do with the supplier adjustment is, well, it's gone ahead and it's assigned a price. But then now if we went and assigned a supplier, so again, let's go to CarQuest. It says, well, let's see, when CarQuest is my supplier, then I want to adjust or I want to assign, and I'll need to close and reopen in order to get that to take effect. Again, if I went to my dealer, again, it's going to readjust as we go through. So again, you can have what we call a supplier adjustment, and I apologize because I never closed and reopened that part. It didn't take effect or didn't show us, but that's the concept, is it's mark it up like this, except if the supplier that I assign is this supplier as we go along. One last piece as far as smart matrix pricing is concerned. If you're going to use smart matrix pricing and you're using smart ECAT, so our Epic or catalog integrations, you're going to potentially, or you're going to get an extra prompt as you go out to the catalog. So if I go ahead and I open up what we call smart ECAT, and I come in here and I'm going to go look up a part. And again, it doesn't really matter what part I'm looking up, but we'll look up a set of front brake pads. You'll notice this pop-up window that comes up. It says no labor job has been defined for this parts lookup. You are using smart pricing based on labor. You want to define the labor now. So if you go to look up parts first, it's going to ask you if you'd like to define the labor. So in this case, I could say, well, sure, I want to use the pricing for my brakes and my install front brake pads job. If we don't, then it's going to use the default until such time as we assign the parts to a labor operation. So again, this prompt is going to come up if you're using smart matrix pricing by associated labor and also using smart ECAT and going out and doing catalog searches for parts. So one extra message box that's going to show up. Close back out of there. And again, that brings me to the end of my conversation this morning about smart matrix pricing by associated labor.